Welcome, I'm Josh O'Connell, and this is episode 4 of Irish Tax Unwrapped. Whether you're a business owner, an investor, or just curious, we break down Ireland's tax code for everyone. In this episode, we're delving into a new development in Ireland's tax landscape, angel investor relief. The aim of the relief is to encourage investment in innovative startups. But as with any new initiative, it has its complexities, and to help us navigate through them, I'm joined by our regular tax expert, Derek Andrews. Hello, Derek.
Hi, Josh.
So let's kick things off with the basics. What exactly is angel investor relief, and what was the government's goal in introducing this?
Angel investor relief is a targeted capital gains tax relief. It's being introduced to encourage individuals, aka angel investors, to invest in early stage innovative startups.
Encourage how?
The idea is that by offering a reduced rate of CGT, 16% instead of the standard 33% on the sale of shares in qualifying companies, the government hopes to boost funding in sectors that are seen as high risk but high reward, particularly technology and innovation-driven startups.
Doesn't entrepreneur relief not already operate to incentivise investors in startups, granting them a CGT rate of 10%?
Entrepreneur relief is targeted at directors or employees who are very active in the business and who must have a minimum shareholding of 5%.
Okay.
If we take a step back, in March 2023, a non-profit supporting Irish tech startups, Scale Ireland, highlighted financial challenges facing Indigenous tech companies to the Joint Committee on Enterprise, Trade and Employment. Scale Ireland represents over 2,000 such companies who in turn employ more than 50,000 people. Their laser focus was on two difficulties: securing funding and retaining staff.
I believe we have some audio from that presentation. This is Martina Fitzgerald, CEO of Scale Ireland, speaking about the Indigenous tech sector. Apart from highlighting funding issues and employee retention, she also spoke about the lack of take-up of key tax schemes due to red tape and costs.
Scale Ireland was set up in late 2019 to promote and represent the Indigenous tech sector. It has an ambitious mission to create the best conditions for startups to thrive and to make Ireland a leading location for innovation and entrepreneurship. There are more than 2,200 Indigenous tech startup and scale companies in Ireland, with almost 1,000 situated outside Dublin. More than 50,000 people are employed nationwide, and for every one job in a startup, 5 more indirect jobs are created in the wider community. Tech startups are export-focused from the beginning, as the level of early-stage investment for research and product development requires global market returns. This means that many companies do not generate any revenue for several years and operate on a negative cash flow basis. The majority of these companies will require a mixture of angel investors, including family and friends, state agency, and VC investment to bring a product to market. Scale Ireland recently published its second National State of Startup Survey 2023. 248 founders and CEOs completed the survey. More than half of the founders surveyed, 51.6%, considered funding to be their biggest challenge in 2022. 83% of respondents are not availing of the KEEP scheme, despite it being specifically set up to facilitate the sector. 73% of those who availed or looked at availing of the Employment Investment Incentive Scheme, which is geared at incentivising more private investment into startups, found the process difficult or not easy. Almost half of respondents found the R&D tax credit scheme complicated, with 2/3 not availing of the credit. Overall, these schemes are not reaching their full potential, a view broadly shared and supported by the Commission on Taxation and Welfare and the government's white paper on enterprise.
That was Martina Fitzgerald, CEO of Scale Ireland, in March 2023. What were their key asks when addressing the government?
Scale Ireland advocated for two main reforms. The first was to address a particular funding gap for scaling companies in a band between 3 and 10 million. The second was to address the need for sustainability plans in startups.
I understand now. The angel investor relief is the government response to these representations. So the aim of the game is to incentivize investors to take the leap into these startups.
Exactly. Tech startups often struggle to secure the funding they need in their early stages. They're usually high risk, and traditional funding sources like banks are reluctant to lend because the businesses have little to no track record of profitability.
So, angel investors step in at this critical stage, providing capital in exchange for equity in the company.
And the angel investor relief is designed to make that proposition more attractive by reducing the tax burden when these investors eventually sell their shares.
This sounds like good policy. But I understand there are concerns about the level of complexity. What are some of the challenges startups will face?
While the relief is certainly welcome, the reality of qualifying for it is far from straightforward. One of the first hurdles is the qualification process for startups themselves. The company needs to obtain 2 certificates from Irish Revenue, a certificate of going concern and a certificate of commercial innovation. This isn't a simple box ticking exercise. Companies need to submit detailed business plans, and those plans must meet certain criteria to show the companies are both financially viable and commercially innovative.
It's not just about being a startup. You really need to prove your business has legs.
You do, and the definition of innovation is quite narrow. A company needs to be an innovative enterprise as defined under EU law. The criteria includes having R&D costs that represent at least 10% of operating costs in the previous 3 years. Now, while that might sound feasible for a tech startup, it's a very high bar for a lot of other early stage businesses, especially those that are pre-revenue or aren't as R&D heavy.
We're already anticipating some barriers for companies to even qualify. What about the process for getting those certificates? Are there any issues with that?
I do have concerns if our experience with obtaining licenses for petroleum companies is anything to go by. Any process that requires a review of business plans has the potential to run into significant delays. There's no prescribed timeline in the legislation for revenue to approve or reject applications, and business plan reviews are so subjective that revenue can and do cherry-pick issues to delay issuing certification. Revenue operate in a vacuum, and they are unmoved by the day-to-day pressures of running a business.
Oh dear. For startups that are trying to secure funding quickly, this could be a major problem.
In my opinion, Revenue need to establish a dedicated clearinghouse for reviewing business plans. A unit that will act with alacrity, one that can be contacted and does not operate through slow mail. Raising capital is often a time-sensitive activity. If investors are interested, you need to close the deal quickly. Any delays could mean losing out on that investment. If the startup is stuck waiting for these certificates, it could really hurt their chances of securing the funding they need.
That does seem like a significant challenge. And from what I've read, this relief is focused on initial risk finance investments. What does that mean for companies that need to raise more than one round of funding?
This is one of the bigger flaws in the current setup. The relief only applies to initial risk finance investment, which essentially means the very first round of external investment that the startup company raises. Most startups will need to raise multiple rounds of funding as they scale and grow, seed rounds, Series A, Series B, and so on. However, this relief doesn't extend to those subsequent rounds. If a company needs additional capital later, those new investors won't qualify for the relief, which could discourage them from investing.
Come on, most startups need more than one round of funding to grow, especially in capital-intensive sectors like tech or biotech. Why wouldn't the relief cover those later rounds?
This is one of the bigger flaws in the current setup. The relief only applies to initial risk finance investment, which essentially means the very first round of external investment that the startup raises. Most startups will need to raise multiple rounds of funding as they scale and grow. Seed rounds, Series A, Series B, and so on. However, this relief doesn't extend to those subsequent rounds. If a company needs additional capital later, those new investors won't qualify for the relief, which could discourage them from investing.
Why wouldn't the relief cover those later rounds?
We are somewhat constrained by EU state aid rules, but the focus on initial investment is likely intended to encourage the very first injection of capital, which is often the hardest to secure. By not extending the relief, though, to later rounds, I wonder if something got lost in translation between the policymakers and the framers, because there's a failure to recognise the reality of startup financing. It's almost inevitable that startups will need more than one round of investment, so this limitation significantly reduces the appeal of the relief for companies that are in that critical scaling phase.
That sounds like a major missed opportunity. Let's talk about the investors now. What kind of conditions do they need to meet to qualify for the relief?
For investors, the conditions are also quite restrictive. The angel investor cannot be already connected to the company at the time of the investment. This connection can take many forms. For example, if the investor is already a director or employee of the company, or if the investor has already provided a loan to the company in the form of a convertible loan note. They may be disqualified from receiving the relief.
That seems like it could be a problem, especially for angel investors who often take on mentorship roles in startups before making financial investments. Does this mean that investors who are involved in the company in some capacity prior to investing might not qualify?
That's right. Many angel investors are more than just financial backers. They're often deeply involved in mentoring founders, helping guide the business, and sometimes even serving as non-executive directors. Under the current rules, if they're already involved with the company in this way, they could be considered connected and therefore wouldn't be able to claim the relief. This really limits the pool of eligible investors, particularly for startups that rely on experienced angels to help steer them through those critical early stages.
You mentioned convertible loan notes as another issue. Can you explain how that works and why it's problematic in the context of this relief?
Absolutely. Convertible loan notes are a common tool in early stage fundraising. The investor loans money to the startup with the understanding that the loan will later convert into equity, usually at a discount or after the company reaches certain milestones. This is a way for the investor to get involved early without immediately purchasing shares.
I think I know where you're going with this.
Under the current legislation, these kinds of arrangement can disqualify the investor from relief because the loan is considered a connection to the company. This is problematic because convertible loan notes are often the most practical way for startups to raise their first round of funding.
This sounds truly crazy. Investors using what is a standard tool in early stage financing might be excluded from the relief.
It's a structural issue that doesn't align with how modern startup financing works.
It sounds like these technicalities are really limiting the usefulness of this relief. What about the minimum investment thresholds? Is there a financial barrier for smaller investors?
So, an individual will qualify in one of two ways. They invest at least 20,000 in eligible shares, or they invest 10,000 if that gives them a 5% interest in the company.
And once they've made that investment, how long do they need to hold on to the shares before they can benefit from the relief?
At least 3 years from the date of the investment. If the investor sells their shares before the 3 years are up, they lose the relief and would have to pay the full 33% on any gains.
So there's a risk involved for investors who might need to access their money sooner. I'm curious, what happens if the investor does exceed the holding period, but the startup doesn't perform well?
If the startup doesn't perform well or even fails, the investor could lose their entire investment. The relief only applies to capital gains, so if there are no gains, meaning the investor doesn't make a profit, then there's no tax benefit. It's important to remember that this relief doesn't protect investors from losses.
That's an important point. This relief doesn't reduce the inherent risks of investing in startups, it just provides a tax incentive for gains. Are there any other limitations or conditions that might affect how attractive this relief is for investors?
Yes, another major limitation is that the relief only applies to the sale of shares. Divestment by other means, like a buyback of shares by a company or a redemption, won't qualify for the relief. So, if the company decides to repurchase shares from its investors rather than selling them to an external buyer, the investors wouldn't benefit from the reduced CGT rate. This could limit the flexibility of exit strategies for both investors and startups.
There are quite a few layers to consider here. With all these complexities, qualification hurdles, restrictions on future funding, issues for angel investors, and procedural delays, do you think this relief will achieve its goal of stimulating investment in startups?
Hard to know, Josh. There's good intent behind the relief. There's clear recognition that startups need more support, and offering tax incentives is a proven way to encourage investment. Ireland is overly reliant on multinational companies for tax revenue and employment. So, in my opinion, this relief is about more than angel investors. It's about developing our indigenous companies, which must be a social and economic priority. However, the complexities and limitations of the current structure could undermine its effectiveness. For smaller startups, which might be the ones that need this the most, the barriers could be too high. For larger startups?
Yeah, for larger, more established startups that have the resources to navigate the administrative process, it could work well, but...
Yeah, the same goes for investors. While some might be willing to go through the steps to qualify, others might be deterred by the restrictions.
Do you think there's any room for reform or improvement in the way this relief is structured?
Oh, for sure. A number of practical and technical changes could go a very long way here, like simplifying the qualification process, expanding the relief to cover subsequent rounds of funding, allowing convertible loans to qualify, and setting up a clearinghouse within revenue that is practical, commercially aware, and gives quick decisions. These alone would better align the relief with the reality of startup financing.
I recall Martina Fitzgerald expressing similar sentiment. Here she is once more.
We believe it is imperative that revenue engages with the sector to look at ways to alleviate the administrative burden on these companies trying to avail of these schemes, while obviously maintaining the necessary safeguards for the Exchequer. Otherwise, any changes to these schemes will not have the intended consequences.
It seems like there's still some work to be done, but it's a step in the right direction. Finally, with the relief set to expire in 2026, do you think there's any likelihood that it will be extended or modified before then?
I think so, Josh. I'm not sure if it's to comply with EU state aid rules, but a number of reliefs, when introduced now, contain a sunset provision. I happen to think that this relief will remain on the books for significantly longer than the initial 24-month period provided for in current law.
Well, thank you so much, Derek, for providing such a detailed look at angel investor relief. It's clear that while the relief has a lot of potential, there are definitely challenges that need to be addressed. We'll be watching closely to see how it evolves. If listeners would like more information on this, how can they contact you?
I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share my thoughts. We provide detailed technical briefings to our clients. They are tailored for owners and investors alike. We also design tax strategies to optimize this and other reliefs. We have a lot of expertise drafting submissions to revenue and managing these to completion. For more information, I can be reached at CoVenture Tax Consulting.
It's clear that the angel investor relief has the potential to fill the much-needed investment gap between 3 and 10 million. Will tech companies find dealing with revenue frustrating? Will investors be deterred by the restrictions on prior connections? Will startups be able to use the scheme for subsequent funding rounds? And will the relief survive beyond 2026? We'll have to wait and see. And with that, we've concluded another episode of Irish Tax Unwrapped. Until next time, keep your finances in check and your tax knowledge sharp.
If you enjoyed this show, please rate, subscribe, and share the podcast. If you've any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, please contact the show on X at Irish Unwrapped or email the show podcast@taxiq.ie.